Hi, Sarah. I'm Bird Kramer. I'm going to be the chair for this session.
Hi, Bird. Nice to meet you. Thank you.
It's nice to meet you. Turns out we're from the same neck of the woods.
Hey. Mo fucking coffee.
Where is that from? Where is it you're from, Bird?
I right now live in Skaneateles Falls.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, that's great. Yeah. So we're from right in Syracuse. Let's see. Is my part? Yep. Keith is here. Hi, Keith.
Hi, everyone.
So, well, that was a quick jump. That was such an amazing session before. I hope that everyone was able to ingest and be ready for this one. My name is Bird Kramer. I am the chair. I'm the keeper of time and the voice of the chat and presentation related questions. I will kindly interrupt when we're getting close to time. Please, everyone, make sure that your mics are muted so that we can hear the presenters. And also, if you are from the CCSD, please make sure in the chat to put at the beginning and the end your name and that you're from CCSD. And without further ado, I will hand the presentation over.
So you're ready for us? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, sorry.
I think I'm waiting for somebody to make my co-host. Okay, he's a co-host now. Wonderful. Give me 1 second as we get ourselves in order.
No worries. I didn't have the chance to ask before everybody came on, but how would the presenters like questions to come through? Would you like me to monitor the chat and wait until the end, or would you like me to interrupt?
No interrupting. I think we need to wait till the end so that both presentations have their 20 minutes. Otherwise,
yep, no worries.
That's not really fair to anyone. So, all right, I'm going to share my screen. Give me a second. No, my screen is being weird. Sorry, I have to unshare my screen. It's doing something strange on my end, which you can't see, but I can see, and it's like being very odd.
James.
There we go.
What's up, Morgan?
How's it going?
Great. Happy you're here.
Of course.
Okay, now I can see things. Okay, so thank you all for coming to our session. And my name is Michelle Falter, and I'm an assistant professor of English education and educational equity at North Carolina State University in Raleigh, North Carolina. And I have the pleasure of presenting with now my former student. He just graduated from our undergraduate middle grades program and is about to start his first job as a middle school English teacher, James Daniels.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good to be here with you all.
We are presenting on this topic, examining Black adolescent female representation in Project Lit YA text. And this is an ongoing study. We're still working through our data, but we have a good chunk of it analyzed, and we're going to spend some time talking about that with you today. So our presentation is going to start with just an overview of our study. We're going to talk about these ideas of joy and pain within Black female stories. And we're going to really focus on the affirming themes that we saw within the texts. And then we'll end on some discussion about what we noticed within them.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Falter. So as we had said, we'll just start talking about our study. So first, we wanted to acknowledge our own positionality. We both introduced ourselves, but we also had two other researchers on our team. And we wanted to acknowledge that our team does include 2 white women, 1 Black woman, and 1 Black male. And we acknowledge that only one of us holds the intersectional identity that we are studying. And amongst the rest of us, that there is only one other who is Black. And though that we have only one individual on our team who can speak to the experience, we each made it our own purpose to strive deeply to understand the text, the characters, and the identities they held, while acknowledging our own identities and experiences may bring biases, which is why we went through the frameworks of critical race theory and critical race feminism, so that we came from the similar and same deconstructionist frameworks. And speaking of which, we can go to the next slide and talk specifically about what it is we are studying. So our focus and our study of these young adult texts was to answer 3 questions using both critical race theory and critical race feminism. And the first is, how and in what ways are Black female characters' lives depicted in Project Lit young adult texts? In what ways do the depictions of Black women and girls within the selected Project Lit texts affirm and censor or negate and marginalize lived experiences of Black people? And what is the significance of these representations in relation to Project Lit's culturally responsive and social justice goals? So if we'll go to the next one. And also just to add on why we care. So first and foremost, we are lovers of young adult literature, as many of you probably are as well. And we want to make sure that this literature is the best for all of our readers. So as researchers, teachers, and librarians, it is our responsibility and duty to ensure that these texts affirm the identities of diverse groups of students and tell stories that represent our youth in a restorative way. And speaking of stories, we also want to center Black girl narratives, because we know the power of storytelling to shape people's lives. And there's actually a quote from a famous writer, Clint Smith, that states, "Symbols aren't just symbols, they're reflective of stories that we tell, and those stories embed themselves into the narratives that a society carries, and those narratives shape public policy, and public policy obviously shapes the material conditions of people's lives." And as we can see in the quote, stories can and do affect the lived experiences of Black girls and Black women in multiple places. And our goal is to ensure that proper storytelling occurs so that these lives can be valued and positive. And last but not least, we wanted to focus strictly on curriculum and addressing the need for Black girl literature in order to fight deficit thinking and restore humanity, because that's the main theme of this conference. So we'll talk a little bit about what Project Lit is, since we've been throwing that term around. And basically, they are a national grassroots literacy movement, and they're a network of dedicated teachers and students who are committed to increasing access to culturally relevant books and promoting a love of reading in schools and communities across America. And if we go to the next slide, these are some of the books that we took from them that had Black girl, Black woman main characters. We'll be sharing these slides, so you don't have to worry about trying to memorize them, and we won't go through them. But these are the books that we decided to focus on, and I'm going to pass it to Dr. Falter for some considerations of these books.
Yeah, so all of those books were from their young adult selections. We chose not to look at the middle grades ones. We were looking more for the complex stories, and they all had, as James said, Black female characters. One of the things that we did notice, though, as we were reading these texts is that, one, we were hoping that these texts showed a lot of joy in these Black girls' experiences, but instead we saw a lot of pain and trauma. And we feel it's important that we talk a little bit first about some of these somewhat problematic aspects of these texts before we get into what was good about them. So one thing we noticed quite a bit is that the Black adolescent females were often sidelined in their own stories. For example, in The Hate U Give, Star is the main narrator, but the story doesn't really revolve so much around Star as it does around her friend who was murdered and even her father. And we saw this in many books. Another thing is that the Black adolescent females often carry a very heavy burden of other people's problems, and they feel guilty about not being able to help them, and often they do like really difficult tasks in order to help their friends and family members, which isn't really fair to them. We also saw a lot of abuse, discrimination, marginalization, and them being ignored within these stories. And that even happened within the fantasy novels, which they have free reign to kind of do whatever they want. And yet we were still seeing those things happen. And then last of all is that we saw a lot of stories were being told in relation to white stories or white communities or white people. Many of the stories were set in predominantly white private schools. And we just wondered, why couldn't the story just been set in just a regular old public school with lots of different people? It seemed to be something that these stories like to do. And so it made us really think about, you know, have we progressed far enough with having access to these texts? And this quote by a publisher wrote that real diversity would celebrate the mundane, like a little kid going out after a snowstorm rather than the exceptional. And our worry is that many of these books focus on the exceptional and not just the everyday life of Black girls. So turning it over to James.
Yes, so as we said, we definitely saw some problematic themes, but we also saw three really big affirming themes across the book. And the first one being the family dynamics and its effect on Black adolescent female development. So in the books we studied, the families of the Black girls and Black women main characters had a significant impact on their development in Black womanhood, whether it had been a Black father or mother speaking directly to them about their womanhood, or it had been a Black mother, grandmother, aunt, or sister demonstrating Black womanhood in a way. And these two stories definitely did those well. If we look at the first one, Slay, which is about a main character, Kiera, who developed sort of a Black fantasy type cultural video game online. Once that quote comes up. Oh, no problem. This quote is actually from Kiera's mother, and she says, "You be whoever you are. Be whoever you are as a strong, beautiful Black woman, and I'll be right here always. I love you. We love you." And as we can see, this is not only just an affirming quote, but an affirming quote from a Black woman who means a lot in this young woman's life. The second one, Tracy, in This Is My America, who is trying to get her father off of death row. This is from her father directly, who says, "You're a fighter.
You want to stop at Walmart, I'll run in."
I love that about you." And I think that this is a beautiful quote in and of itself, because this is even amidst the trauma that is present in this book. This is a great show of how even the Black males in this book, and this one that it's centered around, really lifts up the Black womanhood. And we found that the stronger the Black family dynamic, the stronger the identity and sense of confidence each character had in their Black womanhood.
The second affirming theme that we saw was that Black adolescent female characters had quite a bit of agency and used their voices to change the circumstances in their lives. And so two books that we're going to highlight that show this are Legend Born by Tracy Dion and On the Come Up by Angie Thomas. In Legend Born, we have a main character named Bree who learns about this secret society of the Arthur's Round Table of Knights. And she also notices a lot of inherent racism, discrimination happening in this world. And by the end of the story, she kind of moves outside of her own comfort zone and outside of her head. She often gets in her head and uses her powers, which she learned she has magical abilities, and also her voice to disrupt some of the racism and other acts that are wrong. And in this quote, another character says, "Bree, is that what you want?" And Bree says, "I want to find who's responsible. The words come fast from the quiet thoughts I've buried deep. Use my root abilities, the title I'll gain, and the contacts I have to bring to justice anyone who is involved." So we see her really kind of taking ownership and agency over her own life. And in On the Come Up, we also have a main character named Bree. And Bree is kind of stuck in in the expectations of her father, who has passed away, who is this famous rapper, and she wants to be a rapper too. And throughout the book, she's trying to kind of find her own way, and she makes a lot of mistakes about trusting certain people. But in the end, she uses her voice for positive to try to make change in her community, and also to kind of own her own identity and not feel like she has to be anyone else. And this comes at the very end of the book, in which she raps, and it starts, "I was supposed to come up here and do this new song, but I'd rather do something from my heart. Is that okay with y'all?" James.
I refuse to be their laugh. I refuse to be their pet. I refuse to be the reason some kid now claims a set. I refuse to stand up here and say words that aren't my own. Refuse to be a puppet. Refuse to be a clone. You see, I'm somebody's daughter. I'm somebody's sister. I'm somebody's hope, and I'm somebody's mirror. I'm a genius, I'm a star, call me all of the above, but you'll never call me sellout, and you'll never call me thug. In the garden, kids are starving, hearts are hardened, beg my pardon, but fuck the system. Your assumptions, they just show just where your heart is.
So in both of these texts, we see the characters using their voice, but also literacy skills, their magic skills to really, change their circumstances. And then the third affirming theme is that Black adolescent females successfully are navigating between two worlds or two identities. And again, we saw this in lots of stories. The two that I'm profiling here could be worlds apart in terms of topic and content. Dread Nation by Justina Ireland takes place after the Civil War during the Reconstruction era. And it also includes zombies. So yes, there's zombies, there's Black people, there's white people. Our main character, whose name is Jane, is a very strong adolescent female, Black female. And she is learning how to navigate between these different parties. Some want, there to be the Reconstruction to happen. Some people want it to go back how it was before the Civil War. And she, at one point in the story, she gets captured and gets sent to this other city, and she meets the sheriff. And what happens is this. She says, "Sheriff Snyder, I must confess this is the first time I've seen such a headline. Might I borrow your news sheet to peruse the story at my leisure?" An expression I can't identify crosses his face. "You read?" There's a sudden tension in the room, and I hunch my shoulders and shuffle a bit, letting a slow drawl enter my voice. I prefer to be misjudged as well. And then she goes on to use what would be a stereotypical sort of African-American vernacular. But what she's doing here is she is able to read the situation in this time period, because this is a historic novel. And she uses her wits to kind of get what she wants, which in this case is this newspaper. And so she knows how to play the parts that she needs in order to get what she wants. The story is very fascinating. The second one that I want to share is Clap When You Land by Elizabeth Acevedo. And in this story, we actually have two characters and two worlds, the worlds of New York and the world of the Dominican Republic. And Camino is a girl in the Dominican Republic, and Yahaira is a girl in New York. And they learned that they are actually sisters, and that their father has a relationship with two different women in two different places. So the whole story is about navigating their different identities, their different countries, the different ways of seeing the world. And there's also grappling with their own personal sense of identity. And in this quote, we can see that. Camino says, "The patron saint of the ocean is known for containing many parts of herself. She is a nurturer, but she's also a ferocious defender. And so I remember that to walk this world, you must be kind, but also fierce." And so Camino is really takes a lot of inspiration from the sea, living in the Dominican Republic. And there's beautiful imagery around that. But really, she learns how to navigate these different aspects of her own identity within this story. And then an honorable mention is The Hate U Give, which many of you have read, which there is clearly a Black community in which Star lives in, but then she goes to this very white school and she has white friends and is having to navigate between them. And she does that very successfully, even though she faces difficulties. So we want to talk about two notable books quickly that stood out to us. James?
Yes, and these two notable books were Pride by Ibby Zabowie and Odd One Out by Nick Stone. Pride is a remix of the popular Pride and Prejudice. So, and what this book does, similar to many books like these, is that it closes what's called the imagination gap, which we talked about earlier, which is Ebony Elizabeth Thomas's term that she coined that talked about the gap between what we typically imagine based on stereotype and what kids could imagine when there are stories like these. And it closes this gap by providing an opportunity for Black imagination in traditionally white stories, which is beautiful. And we also saw in this story where Black young women were creating their own definitions of Black womanhood. And lastly, of course, we are familiar with Bishop's idea of windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors. And this was both a mirror that Black women could see themselves in and a sliding glass door where they could step into. Lastly, we wanted to talk about Odd One Out, where we saw a Black woman main character truly exploring her sexual identity and there not being any stigma around that and that just being the norm amongst friends, both cisgendered and straight, which was beautiful because it was a story for story's sake. Embraced identities. And what's important to remember about books like these is that there is resistance to centering Black trauma in these books.
Yeah, so now we're just going to kind of wrap up with a few main points.
And in wrapping up, an idea, I won't say that I coined the concept, but I'll say I coined the term, this idea of restorative envisioning, is that there's an inescapable truth in the fact that the issues these books commonly address, even if they're painful, happen to Black girls and Black women every single day. And these books' response are to address those, and that's okay, and we should embrace that. So we, again, as researchers, teachers, educators, and librarians, should not only embrace these systemic issues, we should also continue to have conversations and discussions around them. And to the right, again, I won't go over all of these for sake of time, but to the right, there are some fascinating congregations of places where you can discuss these books and find books that you can share with youth.
And we have them linked. Yeah.
I'm sorry?
We have them linked for you in the presentation, so.
Yes. Thank you.
Oh, goodness.
Oh, yeah, no problem.
There we go.
And lastly, we just wanted to give a special shout out to Tiffany Jackson, who truly, really talks about the trauma and failures of our institutions and the books that she presented. And these are three that we read that did those well. So I'll pass it off to you, Dr. Falter.
Yeah, so our final thought is
5 seconds left.
Well, this is our final thoughts. I have a minute left on mine. Our final thoughts is that there's some positives, some middle of the road, and some things that are not so great. And the positive is that these authors, these Black authors, are talking about Black pain on their own terms and not in terms of white gaze. And they really are doing it in a nuanced way that creates this moments for healing. And there's a lot of hope in these texts, which we're really glad to see. But we're somewhat leery about whether or not these books address an opportunity gap where Black adolescent girls have opportunities to engage in literature featuring protagonists who have attributes that are relatable to their experiences. It's not wide enough of experiences, we believe. And we are concerned that if these are the only texts that teachers use to include in curriculum, there's still too few books that mirror the complexities of Black identities, too few that center Black girls in them, and too few that explore Black joy. So that's it. Thank you.
You all.
Thanks to my accountability partner, James.
So do we just go per bird? We're just gonna pick it up.
Yep.
Here we go.
Go for
We're going.
Yep.
It's the Keith and Sarah show.
All right, let's go, Keith.
Hi,
That's my.
everyone.
Should we introduce ourselves first while you're putting up the slides?
Yes, there's my email. Check my email out, folks.
Okay.
Go ahead, Dr. Fleming.
All right, so hi everybody. I'm Sarah Fleming, and I'm so excited to be here. And I am a high school English teacher up in Syracuse, New York, a recent graduate of Syracuse University. And I am here today with my friend and thought partner, Mr. Keith Newvine. Keith?
Keith Newvine, Syracuse University PhD candidate, wearing my Hawaiian shirt today because it's Saturday and I'm a teacher and I am on vacation. I also am a full-time English teacher at West Genesse High School for the next couple of days.
So today's presentation is actually a little more of a practicing teacher's presentation. We are going to talk to you and share with you something that the two of us are doing, which follows nicely along with our presenting partners here in terms of Project Lit. And then also, if you missed the Disrupt Text Movement presentation, I don't know what to say, because you need to just leave our presentation. This is what we say every time we present together. Keith says, don't listen to us. Go find the hashtag Disrupt Text. We'll send you our slides. They're the ones doing this work, and they are the ones who inspire us to do this. So just shout out to them right away, because none of this would be possible without the work they're doing. So as they said, cite Black women.
Yes, if they're here, if they're in like another session or something, just as a guest, go find them and just start a chat with them.
That's right.
We have nothing else to say. Also, I just want to say, James, Michelle, you could keep talking for 20 minutes and we would have been totally fine with that as well. So anyway, here we go. Up to you, Dr. Fleming.
All right, so we are going to try to accomplish these things in our short amount of time. And when we don't, they are all in the slides and we will share our slideshow with you. So you may go ahead and peruse them and then email us at will and tweet with us, and we would be delighted to extend the conversation. So we're going to start by reviewing a little bit just the concepts and the elements of dystopia. We're going to do a quick plot overview of the books that we're working with today. It's just to talk a little bit about the classic text Fahrenheit 451 and then Scythe by Neal Shusterman. We'll do some examples of some close analysis and critical inquiry, and then we're going to close by talking about an assessment that we used with our students in both of our classrooms, called the Living Library, that relates to what we want to do with dystopia and how we are disrupting our curricula using these texts. Keith, you want to do this?
Sure. These are the characteristics of dystopias that NCTE came out with in 2006. I know you're going to be thinking, wait, I'm living in all of these conditions right now, or at least I was for like the last few years. Zoom and COVID has happened, and all of a sudden I realized that information and independent thought and freedom are restricted by so much. No, but honestly, these are the qualifications or the characteristics of dystopian societies that we focus on in our reading of these texts, so that students can understand the genre of dystopias, which oftentimes are a little bit more accessible for youth. In this imagination gap, which James and Michelle and both Trisha and Julia talked about as well, we feel like dystopias and fantasy novels can open up that imagination a little bit more for folks, for imagining worlds that they might never see, hopefully never see in this case. Go ahead.
No, you go right ahead.
No, I was just clicking on it.
Okay, so clicking away, Keith. So we know that dystopia often plays a role in the classic canon that we see in our classrooms, and that typically in 1984, Lord of the Flies is actually the book that was on my curriculum when I inherited a new course this year. And that was the text that I chose to replace by adding instead a contemporary dystopic text, which is Scythe. We know that young people are really, the genre of dystopia speaks to them. It probably has something to do with being, relating with people who are feeling powerless. And so we see, that how swept up they were in the Hunger Games trilogy and the Divergent trilogy. And students have found, at least just anecdotally, I can say that my students who have read the Scythe trilogy just can't put it down. And it's been incredibly successful, both academically and then also just for kids reading for pleasure.
I just think it's also important to know that what we might consider the classic texts on the left are books that are taught to youth but aren't written for youth. It wasn't like William Golding was like, boy, I'm going to write this great YA text. No, not what he had in mind. And George Orwell was not considering young adults when writing this text. But The Hunger Games, Catching Fire, Divergent, those are stories that center on the lives of youth. And Neal Shusterman does that even more so in these more recent texts. And that is one important shift for us, moving away from books that are taught to youth but aren't written for youth or don't have youth in mind being created.
That was one of the things when we saw that graphic that Trisha and Julia shared with us about who's marginalized, young people in themselves. So that's another rationale for using young adult literature, is because that is our audience. And we, out of respect for our audience, want to share with them stories that center their experiences. Excellent.
So we're going to start by defining dystopia with a canonical text, as Julia and Trisha and Lorena and Dr. Kim Parker talk about. This is not about throwing away the text and replacing it. It can be and likely should be about reading things alongside, but maybe centering what is often supplemental and moving what is often centered to the margins. So we use, I use Fahrenheit 451 as sort of a foundational understanding of what the genre of dystopic literature looks like. I won't assume that lots of people have read this. In fact, what we learned in the last presentation, or what Brian Ripley Crandall reminded us in the chat, was that lots of times folks learned how to fake read. So I'm not gonna go over this, but it is important to sort of recognize whose story is told here and whose story isn't told.
Yeah, Keith, I might have fake read this in high school myself. Real read it later as a grown-up.
Right in my heart.
I'm sorry, I know I love it, but I didn't then.
No, it's fine. It's fine. No, Guy Montag, the main character, a fireman who no longer wants to be a fireman. His wife, Mildred Montag, who is made inept in this text for a specific reason, but also terribly marginalized and terribly stereotyped. Clarice McClellan, a 17-year-old who is Guy Montag's first sort of guide out of the cave. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But again, she disappears halfway through the text. And so instead we focus on Captain Beatty, the Antichrist figure or the antagonist here, Professor Faber, who's Montag's second guide out of the cave. Granger and the hobo intellectuals who have committed texts to memory become tertiary characters. And at the very end, you'll see that there's a big list of women, Mrs. Phelps, Mrs. Bowles, and the old woman, all of whom serve important roles in this text, but only as fodder for Guy Montag's journey. So in the conversation about whose story is told and whose story isn't, this is certainly one that deserves that criticism. In this particular case here, when I talk to students about how propaganda is used, I really focus on the talk from Captain Beatty. Montag is sick, quote unquote sick, because he recently just, don't tell anybody, but he stole a book, okay? We've all done it, it's fine. And he decides not to go to work, and Beatty comes over and talks to him and says, here's how we got here. And in this really long quote, we realize what Beatty is talking about is that propaganda has been used to control citizens, right? That society realized that having too much information and having everybody's voice be equally valued is problematic. So what did they do? Narrowed everything down to 2 sentences in a headline. And so we really see in graphic ways by going over to particular news stations and having news clips, right, or sound bites that become the thing that that people latch on to. And so we connect what Bradbury talks about to what we see in politics even today as a dystopic characteristic. Another characteristic that we talk about that might sadly still be true today is about citizens conforming to uniform expectations. Again, this one is especially important because what Beatty says that it wasn't the government who decided to create these uniform expectations. The people wanted it, all right? The groups of individuals said, no, we don't want all of these problems. We want one way of doing and one way of being. And so it's a really interesting parallel to contemporary times, AKA January 6th, right? And other forms of uniform expectations. And then the last one that's certainly relevant in Scythe by Shusterman is people being constantly surveilled and dehumanized. And Sarah's going to talk much more about this later. But the fact that we can rid ourselves of all odd ducks. This is after Beatty tells Montag that Clarice was killed. And he says that what we've started to do instead is indoctrinate them very young, right? And to really make sure that we dehumanize them over short periods of time. Mm-hmm. Some of the critical inquiry questions that we focus on in the reading of this, and I say pre-imagining, right? Because Bradbury sort of imagined a world that we're living in now, sadly. Well, maybe I am. I'm maybe just having a bad day. I keep saying we. Keith is living in a dystopia. But in what ways has censorship of literature occurred in the past and present? And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. We talk about ignorance as bliss or knowledge as precious, and how knowledge is a commodity in today's world, a Google search away, as it were. Certainly the one that resonated most with my students who were remote learning, who I met with for a year now on Zoom, technology deadening the human experience. And then we asked ourselves some questions about what Bradbury does in creating his world and how it falls in a timeline of historical events by connecting the past to the present. And I did that, and these are all hyperlinked in the presentation, and I'll put them in the chat a little bit later. I always teach Fahrenheit 451 through Plato's allegory of a cave by helping them understand this allegory and how it might lead to Montag. There is the document for that. And then in the second document, the red one, we learn about the Nuremberg book burning in World War II and how that was people who wanted to do it. The students and the professors started that book burning, and we learn about that, talk about how it's relevant in Bradbury's world, and then we actually connect it to recent book burnings that have been taking place, which is just a Wikipedia page away. In the third, in the green one, we talk about media's effect on politics. We learn about the Nixon and Kennedy debates and how Nixon didn't look so hot, as it were, on the first televised debate. And Bradbury predicts that actually in the text. It talks about how Hubert Hoag lost to Winston Noble because he didn't shave. And then the last one, and I wish I could say that this was intentional, but it was the actual day of the 100-year anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre. And so, and it was on the day that the bomb dropped in Bradbury's text. And so it was like perfect storm of events. So we used that moment to learn about the history of the Tulsa Race Massacre and the similarities that Bradbury might have foretold, sadly.
Okay, so quickly to talk a little bit about now using Scythe to disrupt using contemporary texts. So what I chose to do this year is I deliberately decentered the text, the classic text that was there, that existed ahead of time, which was Lord of the Flies, actually. And we do use Fahrenheit in places in our curriculum, in our 912 curriculum. So what I did is chose to not use the entire text of Fahrenheit, but instead we went through some of the plot points. I explained to my students what happened. I showed them a few scenes from the newer version of the movie, not the whole movie, just a few, just to give them some context. And I did that later on to be able to show them what the living library assessment is. So just as a quick overview, if you don't know any of the plot details from Scythe, so the premise of the story is that it's a futuristic world it's futuristic enough by a few hundred years that we have conquered death. And we have medical marvels that have allowed people to no longer have to suffer with being sick or ill, that they can, through medical marvels, simply sort of regenerate themselves, and that includes even if they die. So in order to manage the population, there is a group of people called the Scythes who have to work as essentially sort of like Grim Reapers. And their job is to choose who needs to die in order to keep the population under control. Otherwise, people are able to reset themselves and they can continue to live on for several hundreds of years. The two main characters are Citra and Rowan, and they are the apprentices learning how to become Scythes. And there's a big to-do about how that happened and whether they chose to do so or not. There's a series of Scythes who seem to be our good guys and our bad guys. And what we have are two different philosophical approaches as to why the people who become Scythes should either take pleasure in their jobs, and if they should do so really with a sense of satisfaction, or if they should do so begrudgingly out of a respect for the seriousness of their job, which is to the only ones who enact death on anyone. Keith, can you go ahead? We'll just move. We only have a few minutes left. So to talk a little bit about sort of how this works as a dystopia, we have to talk about what the concept of a utopia is, and then we go through those characteristics that Keith mentioned earlier. So this is a culture that is under constant surveillance, but the people have been sort of they've turn themselves into thinking that this is a good thing and that this is a safe thing, that they are under the surveillance of the Thunderhead, which is a really bigger version of our internet, that watched the world from millions of eyes, listening from millions of ears, that either acted or chose not to act on the countless things it perceived. And this society is an illusion of a perfect utopian world. The people think that they have achieved perfection when it comes to social structures. They think that there is no poverty and that there is no class and that everyone is equal. But what we find and what we need to talk about with kids is the fact that that's not in fact the case, and that how the author has crafted this story gives us the opportunity to be critical of that, which is kind of what Julia and Trisha were talking about earlier, how to address the book and read through this book with a criticality that demands that we don't accept this world as being actually utopic. So can you go ahead? Oh, there's something up on my screen. So one of my favorite parts of the book is this understanding that the Scythes have to glean people, and that every year they have an audit of the number of people they've gleaned and essentially the ethnic or racial parameters in which they have kept their gleaning, so that they are not, it's meant to sort of prevent them from biases. And one of the Scythes keeps a journal, and we read through her journal throughout the book. So what we have here is an example of the text from her journal when she's explaining, and Scythe Curie is questioning whether or not that we've actually, that having to work within these accepted parameters is effective. She says, this year when they crunched each cultural index from those I gleaned over the past 12 months, I thankfully came up well within the accepted parameters: 20% Caucasoid, 18% Afric, 20% Pan-Asian, 19% Meso-Latino, and 23% other, because in this future, national boundaries have changed. And so we have different names and different language for how to identify people. So it's sometimes hard to know. A person's index is considered private, so we can only go by visible traits, which brings up a very important conversation to have with students. So the index is supposed to keep the world free from cultural and genetic bias, but aren't there underlying factors that we can't escape? For instance, who decided that the first number of one's genetic index would be Caucasoid? So for example, that's a huge conversation to have with students. Are we still centering whiteness even in this supposedly perfected society? And so Keith, if you can go ahead. That's another thing that the characters, when they think about, when they are discussing why they were chosen to be Scythe apprentices, one of the questions was perhaps they have some similarity when it comes down to their genetic index. So they share their numbers with each other. And the first set of numbers is Citra's numbers, 22, 37, 12, 14, 15. So her number 37, he says, ooh, 37% Afric, good for you, that's pretty high. And then he identifies his codes, and then we have to have a conversation with the students about what that might mean in terms of how they're presenting. If you were to do a quick Google image search for fan art, you would see that a lot of people, when reading this book, might overlook these details, because the question is, how does Citra present? Is Citra presenting as someone who might be who might have darker skin, lighter skin? Does this have to do with readers bringing their own identities to the book? Are we not reading closely enough? There's so many conversations to be had here that have to do with disrupting our typical notions as readers and how we enter into the books with our own sense of what is quote unquote the norm. I know we're out of time, so Keith, can you just go ahead really quickly through a few slides? So the living library assignment is how we end this unit with after having done this, and this comes directly from the ending of the book Fahrenheit. Keith, can you go through your section right here?
Sure. This is, again, this is hyperlinked here, but this is an overview of the assignment that students have to choose a novel that they believe, a text that they believe deserves to be memorized, like Montag and the hobos do at the end of the book. And so it allows for them to become a text, a living text.
And so these are examples of two of my students who they had to choose. I had them choose which text they would like to preserve. If they could preserve and be one book, which would be the book that they would want to preserve and to see live on in the canon, and most of them chose more contemporary texts. So this is an example of my first student who chose The Hate U Give, and one of his reasons for doing so was that it's important to see how it is for a Black person in America as opposed to Kill a Mockingbird. So following our earlier conversation, it's always, was this person on drugs? Is this person using fake money? Is this person wearing a hood? As if they were the ones who brought death upon themselves, or even if they did something illegal, as they deserve death. It's a story that can be consumed and absorbed by a wide, I think he said wide, but he could have said white, audience. But the reason I'm sharing this example is that this is his rationale for why this book is a book that deserves to live on. The second student listed here, she talks about perks of being a wallflower, and she does that. She thinks it's important to keep that book in the canon, and that one deserves to survive because of how it treats mental health and depression and self-harm and suicide and wrestling with one's personal and sexual identities. And she says it's just not sugar-coated. We had a really nice conversation about why she thought that book should survive the book Holocaust. If you want to read more about it, this is Keith and I have put this together in this particular chapter that just came out last year. That's all we need to say about that. And we have our contact information here at the very end.
That's it for us. Thanks for coming to our show.
And Keith, you said that you would put the link to your slides in
Oh.
the chat.
Yeah, I'm doing that right now.
Thanks so much. I'm sorry to have cut short. I know we transitioned so quickly. There is still a few minutes for questions. And Michelle and James, there were 2 questions that were in the chat that I want to bring to your attention. Someone asked, how does Project Lit choose their books?
So I don't actually know exactly how they choose their books. I do know that it was started by a teacher and his students. His students were really the impetus for it in Tennessee, in Nashville. And that group of students has graduated since then. I'm assuming that he has a board that kind of rolls now, and they somehow sit and decide. I don't know what their process is, but then once you get this huge list of books, I mean, it's over 150 books, then the Project Lit sites, which are schools, it really is supposed to be that students within those clubs or within those classrooms get to have agency and choice in picking which books they want to talk about. That's a big part of Project Lit's mission, is that students are going to be the ones who kind of lead those discussions and pick the books. But the big list is not very clear how that actually comes about.
I'll make it clear because I'm a Project Lit leader, and so is
good.
Funny. So
Yeah, we are locally in Syracuse. So.
Perfect.
Yeah, that's why we loved, we probably mentioned in the abstract, so that's why we're all grouped together, I think.
let's write an article together. Jared and all the Project Lit leaders recommend books, all of the teachers, and all of those books get sent to all of the Project Lit teachers, and they vote for them, and then they make a final decision after majority rules, and then individual clubs can choose whatever books that they want to focus on and have conversations about.
So like we'll do that, we'll go through that process again next year at the beginning of the school year. There'll be a new list that comes out.
Gotcha.
But again, those are suggested, yeah.
Yeah, cool.
The second question for Michelle and James is, what are some BAF joy books that you would recommend?
Well, the 2 that we really highlighted for sure, Pride and Odd One Out. And hopefully you noticed that we highlighted joy throughout many of those books. So they have joy in them. Some of them, like Tiffany Jackson's books, have way less joy in them. So I would say a lot of these books do. But James, do you have any other ones that you want to spotlight?
I definitely think those 2 main ones. I think some other ones that you can consider are The Poet X. That wasn't on this one, but that one's a really good one. And honestly, I would say With the Fire on High is a really good one as well. And I can throw those in the chat.
Yes. Oh, and I'm glad Brian brought this up. It's going to come out not in 22 and 21. Brian, is coming out this fall. Not Black Boy Joy, but it's a edited series by Kwame Mbalia, and it's coming out, and I'm ecstatic. It'll be a bunch of short stories and poems and things from young adult authors about Black boys. So if you want to see something in comparison to Black girls, that'll be a great one. Yeah, people are putting some great recommendations. I think the biggest thing we just want to highlight is that whenever a curriculum is put in front of you, you don't want to just take it as face value. You got to do the critical work to look at what's in these texts. And just because, you know, Project Lit is highlighting these as great texts, and for the most part, we would argue that they are, there still is some problematic aspects, and there's places for Black authors to continue to grow and move, and how publishers present certain stories, there's room for them to grow and move.
So we have about 1:48 left. If anybody has any more questions they'd like to put in the chat, or quickly unmute to ask our 4 presenters. And also, if you are part of CCSD, don't forget to put your name again in the chat because they're checking, I think, at both the beginning and the end.
Michelle, I just finished teaching Pride with my seniors, and it went over so nicely. It was really good. That's
Yeah,
a great book.
it is. It really is. Just makes you happy.
I'm going to do it again next year in the fall when some of them are doing college application process, because I think it's a nice time to do that.
Yeah. And I wrote in the chat too, Scythe, if you have not read it, read it. I do not know a single person who does not love that series.
We can't do it justice in 20 minutes. There's so many conversations that come up in terms of power and science and religion, and it's just phenomenal.
Yeah. James
Thank
knows
you.
one of our other students that was in his cohort was obsessed with Scythe.
Mhm.
I mean, obsessed, like was like waiting for the last book to come out, and she read it ahead of everyone else and then had to tell everyone how good it was. So
I see that Keith in the chat's also talking about Unwind, which is also Neal
yes.
Shusterman's series, which is phenomenal too. Absolutely. And the kids love it.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree.
I really do like and Unwind, bringing up the whole what does make a person, right?
Mhm.
That is addressed throughout that whole entire series, which I think was really, sorry not to jump into the conversation.
No.
I'm a huge Neal Shusterman fan, and
Yeah.
I'm so afraid to say that this is the end. This was an incredibly informative, educational, like my mind is just, there's just so many things running through it. I'm so grateful to have chaired this, and so grateful to the four of you for the work that you put in and brought to this conference. And yeah, it was just amazing. So with that, thank you so very much, everyone, for attending. And
Hi, big brother.
Your little sister wanted to say hi. There she is.
Hey, Brian.
Come visit.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah,
Bye.
thank you, everybody.